This is Cody Lee of blackcatbooks.org, author of I the Dragon, Cruel and Beautiful, Rabbit Hole, King Dio, Lauren Frey, Clover, Grimm, and the upcoming Jaw of the Dragon. So, I recently did a poll on my channel asking people what you wanted to see going forward when it comes to Pretendo history, the series in which we go back and go down nostalgia lane and just revisit some of the ancient Pretendo narratives that have surfaced, rose to prominence, and then be promptly eliminated once they had served their purposes. And the one that people overwhelmingly wanted to see from me was third parties on Wii U. And I find that very interesting because I think this kind of thing, the third party on Wii U situation, is absolutely something that needs to be talked about. It was something I was very passionate about during the Wii U era. It was something I talked about a lot. It was something that was discussed quite often on NeoGAF back when that was still relevant, on YouTube, on other platforms. It was something that kind of defined the Wii U as a whole. And over the years, I think people have kind of settled on a narrative for it, in that like third parties were right about everything and Nintendo completely failed to sell the Wii U. But in reality, what happened is that third parties intentionally sabotaged the new Nintendo consoles in order to prevent another Wii and prevent what's happening now to the Switch. In that, like, it is the primary video game platform for a lot of people. Nintendo has essentially established a monopoly with the Switch that is kind of, or is, I should say, putting a lot of pressure on third parties and really putting an end to this sort of facade that's been going on since the introduction of the Sony PlayStation. The attempt to make Nintendo, the industry-wide conspiracy to make Nintendo go third party has failed. But the absolute crux of that conspiracy, the main thing that the consumer kind of feels, that the consumer notices, that the consumer has to justify, has to like kind of just deal with, is the fact that third parties have never supported Nintendo consoles in any meaningful capacity since the introduction of the Sony PlayStation. Now, over the years, the narrative has like shifted quite a lot from like cartridges are an unviable platform for video games in this day and age, for the N64, which was never true. The GameCube, it has a weird controller, man. I don't even know what the excuse for the GameCube was. Uh, like why third parties didn't support that thing. I think what they settled on eventually was sales. Wii, the biggest platform in the world, right? Huge deal, like huge best-selling platform that third parties did not support in any meaningful capacity at all. And the thing about the Wii, in particular, um, cons- third parties were able to successfully limit the success of N64 and GameCube by refusing to support their biggest games on it. Like, we never got stuff like Silent Hill, we never got stuff like Grand Theft Auto, we never got like a lot of the Call of Duties. Like, there were a lot of big major games that simply never saw Nintendo releases. Resident Evils, like there were a lot of big Nintendo games, a lot of big games that just never came to Nintendo platforms. And so when it came to the Wii, though, even though third parties refuse to support the most popular platform in the world in any meaningful capacity for that console generation, they were still able to kind of weirdly convince the public that, like, oh, you just only buy a Wii for Wii Sports or Wii Fit for the casual stuff. You can kind of go back and see how that played out in like the media and the reception. All of this, by the way, has kind of died down in recent years. Once people are like able to go back and like experience the consoles for what they are, they do kind of develop like a real legitimate following. And now there are dedicated groups of people who hate these consoles who will like stand by this industry wide agenda to try and talk down to them and try to say that like Nintendo hasn't been good since the Super Nintendo. Um, I can name a lot of YouTubers like that. People like Spoonie, people like Angry Joe who just refuse to cover Nintendo content in any meaningful capacity. But those were like the older consoles, like retro stuff. Like, what is the deal with Wii U and the third parties? What a lot of people don't understand is that in the early stages of Wii U, Nintendo, the big driving force behind Wii U, something that Nintendo took into deep consideration, something that Nintendo really wanted to do, was that they really, really wanted to fix this problem. They really wanted to create a platform that would be appealing to third parties, that would get all of the same third party games, and they would design the console to sort of be, while still retaining what made the original Wii successful, would make it easier for third parties to put their kinds of games on the platform. In particular, the Wii U gamepad was designed like a traditional controller with like a giant screen in the middle that could easily be ignored if you just wanted to do like a straight port of your game or whatever. Something designed like very similarly to the competitors' controllers, right? So, with the option to use like pro controllers and things like that, um, third parties were very heavily promoted in the early days to Wii U. Like back when the console was unveiled, one of the things that Nintendo really strongly emphasized is that we've been talking to third parties. We're getting games like Deus Ex, but we're getting games like Mass Effect 3. We're getting Batman Arkham City. We're getting exclusives like Zombie U on top of like the new upcoming first party Nintendo games. Stuff like Pikmin 3, stuff like New Super Mario Bros. U, stuff like Nintendo Land. The Wii U was putting a lot of emphasis on the big third party content. Now, the thing about this is, first of all, they focused a lot on ports. And I think from Nintendo's perspective, the idea was to kind of emphasize that the ports were games that like had not come out on Wii, that were not available for the Nintendo audience, and that like they might just pick up like stragglers or stuff like that. But I think they kind of underestimated just how quickly people move on from these shallow derivative third party games because by the time that like Arkham City came out, by the time like Deus Ex came out, by the time like Mass Effect 3 came out, like everyone in their target audience had already played them and had no interest Nintendo in Nintendo's version. In fact, one of the things that Spoonie emphasized in that video he made in his like filthy fucking kitchen, uh, the one where he predicted the downfall of Nintendo. Like one of the things he brought up was that like Nintendo, um, I've already played these games, right? And he kind of held that against Nintendo. To be fair, if you've already played the games that are on third-party consoles, just play the stuff that hasn't come out yet. Play the new stuff. There were plenty of new games on Wii U announced immediately. Stuff like Zombie U, stuff like Rayman Legends, stuff like Pikmin 3, stuff like New Super Mario Bros. U, stuff like Nintendo Land, Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate came out in March. Like there were all these great Nintendo games right out of the gate that people like Spoonie kind of writ off and ignored because had written off and ignored just because that they hate Nintendo. Like they only care about feeling hardcore and and playing mature games for mature gamers. Like that was a very big mindset for millennials back in the day, 10 years ago. Like that was a big thing for them. Like they can't own homes, they can't like do anything with their lives, but they have to play video games that make them feel like successful, mature adults. That's the mindset that people like Spoonie were in, like the gaming media, all of these people right out of the gate were trying desperately to pretend that Nintendo's first party titles were worthless, that they were derivative, that they were uninspired, that they weren't all that weren't all that compelling, and that the third parties were the developers to watch in the future. This is actually looking back on it, it was the thing right out of the gate to focus on the third party support for Wii U. Like this is the stuff that people were focusing on and talking about. Like and and with time, right? It became very apparent, like after the release of Wii U, even during pre-release, I would say it became very apparent that there was something wrong with the way third parties were handling development on this console. Uh, First of all, the thing I noticed is just how undesirable a lot of these ports even were. Like I was in theory the hypothetical ideal consumer for Nintendo, these Nintendo third party ports, right? Someone who had like did not grow up with any of the competitors' consoles, who didn't care for them, who was getting into this stuff for the first time. One of the things I noticed when I went out to buy stuff like Assassin's Creed 3, stuff like Deus Ex Human Revolution, stuff like Batman Arkham City. A lot of the upgrades, a lot of like the adjustments, like the improved versions, like a lot of it was a lot of the improved aspects of these games were very superficial and did not add a lot to the game. At Arkham City, it basically just gave you a different bat suit that had like a power that lets you hit enemies a little bit harder. I actually don't know if they've actually put the armored suit into other versions of the game, but I don't think I saw it when I looked at my Xbox One version. But I I hated Arkham City. Right? Like I thought it was boring as fuck. It wasn't the best superhero game ever made. It was actually the game that really turned me against third party developers because this was one of the most overhyped games ever made at the time, and the fact that like it disappointed me that much showed a lot about it. Stuff like Deus Ex Human Revolution, right? Uh, you know, Theoretically, like from what I understand, that was actually a very good port from the a very good improved version from its competition, in which I think it fixed like the main problem with the original, like that it had like really poor boss fights. That they were a little bit better in this one, but um, the thing about this game is they released this game at a solid $40, but re-released it on other consoles for 30, the same version with like the same improvements on other consoles for a lower price, even though this version of the game was deliberately designed for Wii U and actually took advantage of some Wii U features. I think the gamepad had some better implementation than we've seen from most other third-party games at that point. Again, I haven't played like the SX in forever. I don't remember a thing about it actually, but I do remember that that it seemed like the game was intentionally sabotaged, right? Mass Effect 3. This is probably the defining example. They released the third game in a heavily story centric series on a console that did not get the first two games. And as anyone who's played Mass Effect knows, like a big part of the appeal is just going through the game, going through the first game, and like building up your karma to influence decisions and like be heavily invested in the story and world, right? Now it doesn't do that well because Mass Effect is pure shit and one of the most overrated IPs of the past decade. I never thought Mass Effect was good, but the reason I to this day I never picked up the Mass Effect 3 on Wii U was because EA released the entire trilogy on other consoles very soon after that. I don't want to know. I don't remember exactly how long it was, but it was definitely by 2013. Like, why in the world would I buy Mass Effect 3 on Wii U when there are better versions of the game on there? Now, the narrative has always been that like, oh, this is Nintendo's fault. Nintendo like set the Wii U up for failure. It was like it was doomed from the start. But when you look at what third parties were doing, Capcom re-releasing like old Monster Hunter games, releasing Square Enix releasing overpriced ports, EA like not even releasing all of their games, like it really does come off as if companies were deliberately not putting their best foot forward. Like I remember EA Sports weren't putting out like their best versions of sports games. Like it seemed very deliberate to sabotage the Wii U in its very, very first year. And it really did come off that way. Like for that entire 2013 period, like you'll notice like weird things like Zombie U. It was destroyed by critics when it came out on Wii U. But what happened when they removed the touchscreen controls and ported it to Xbox One and PS4? They the game critics, game journos gave it higher scores in spite of being a lesser port, right? Like it stripped away aspects that made Zombie U unique and interesting. And it's again that's a deeply flawed game, but I think anyone who legitimately played it and tried to experience it kind of knows that wow they really they really sabotaged uh, it doesn't make any sense. Like the criticisms lobbied at Wii U and its third party support never made any sense. Like the 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 narrative was always that this was Nintendo's fault, that they should have done more for third parties, they should have released more powerful hardware. But in reality, it was the third parties just going out there, putting out products that nobody wanted. Late ports, games that didn't run well, games that were overpriced, games that like nobody really had any interest in. They did not put their best foot forward, and by mid 2014, the third party games essentially came to a stop. Like the third parties shifted to full support of the newer, shinier platforms on Xbox One and PS4. And for an entire console generation, we had to deal with this nonsense of just third parties just deriding Nintendo at every possible opportunity, like trying to legitimately trying, it seems, to drive them out of business. Now, by the time the Switch came out, dominating the console industry, Breath of the Wild destroying every other open world game ever made, Nintendo establishing itself as the industry leader. This has not changed. Like third parties still are not supporting Nintendo consoles, even though the Switch has dominated the sales charts for years now and really has no signs of stopping. Now, YouTubers and game journal shills are still trying to like deride Nintendo, but are still trying to go after Nintendo. Calling the Switch hardware antiquated and stuff like that. But they don't really have the control that they really thought they did, right? Like I think the Wii U primarily was just the result of bad timing and stuff that like uh the industry had been building up to for years. It culminated with the Wii U, but now that we're past that point, now that we've gone through an entire console generation where third parties made their contempt for Nintendo very clear, I think Nintendo fans are at the point where like we simply don't care about third party games. It's a case where they did not support Nintendo at their lowest moment, and now that we're we're past that, and now that we're in a high period, one of an all time a potential all time high period. Nobody really even notices or cares that they're not there on Switch either. Like all these companies are failing on PS5 and Xbox Series X. Like EA lost FIFA, Capcom is Resident Evil is basically dead. Um, Konami is dead. Like so many of these classic video game developers that Square Enix is going downhill with like Final Fantasy and everything they're doing, all the nonsense they're putting out. Life is Strange exists. Like these companies that spent the past 25 years trying to drive Nintendo out of business have essentially collapsed in and on themselves. They just failed to do what they were trying to do, and which was to completely control the industry and force you to pay for microtransactions for every time you pop the game in or whatever. It was it was really pathetic, honestly, to see these people seriously try and create this agenda, this narrative about Nintendo, that they didn't want to work with third parties, that there was no demand for third party games on Nintendo hardware, because I think in the Wii U days that was like the most we'll ever want third party content. Like it was a time when Nintendo was transitioning to HD development, games weren't coming out quickly, and above all else, Nintendo was trying to allow third parties the chance to thrive on their platform. But third parties chose to spit in their face, chose to do their thing and pretend that Nintendo was beneath them. And now, in 2023, 2022, that's coming back to bite them. I never again. I have grown up learning to despise these companies. I hate Square Enix. I hate Capcom. I hate Sega. I hate like any company that seriously tried to destroy Nintendo, especially PlayStation. I I've learned to despise these corporations, and as a result of that, like I never again am going to take what they say about Nintendo consoles seriously, and I very much doubt I'm the only one. My channel is growing. I've been talking about this kind of stuff for a long time. And I think people are really starting to catch on to the fact that the primary purpose of gaming journalism, of these third party developers, is is a vehicle for PlayStation to attack Nintendo. That's that's all it's ever been.